We live in the blues era. There might have been the classical era, and the romantic era, or the Baroque era. We've been living in the blues era since Jelly Roll Morton published Jelly Roll Blues.
On Soul Country Podcast number 3, I sat down with Chris Thomas King, a Grammy-winning musician, film actor, and songwriter, now author of The Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture. We talked about the book, his career, and the history of Louisiana blues and its Creole origins. I'm Rick Stewart, a community radio DJ and award-winning filmmaker, now podcasting to get deeper into soul country. Tales from the intersection of Americana and R&B. Listen in as we revitalize our cultural roots in westerns, blues, and variety. And now, a word from our sponsor. Ace Production produces Soul Country for the Blues Center. Ace offers consulting and video production, YouTube channels, digital strategy, and team building for companies large and small. To ace your production, access acedust.com. Chris joined me during a mid-Jazz Fest week in New Orleans uptown in a hastily constructed studio, and we opened up a no-holds-barred conversation on the music, culture, and business of blues. The Authentic Narrative of My Music and Culture by Chris Thomas King. Quote, "Yet our greatest invention, the blues, has been anglicized and stripped of its Creole meaning and cultural significance. The Louisiana Creole term, blues, or bleu, the original name the originators gave their musical invention in songs such as Jelly Roll Blues, Buddy Bolden's Blues, etc., celebrated subversion, discordance, and freedom of expression among blacks in Louisiana whose preordained underclass status constitutionally liberated them socially and musically. Blues mocked Victorian prudishness. It was a humanizing force that threatened to normalize black sensuality." So that opened up a few different avenues that you go into in depth in the book, but could you situate our audience members a little bit on what you're getting into there?
Yeah, first I'll give everybody a definition. We all speak, the King's English here in America, so that's our first language. And so when we hear the word blues, we think in that definition, the English definition, sad, depressed, melancholy, that type of thing. But in New Orleans, it's important for everybody to understand that the black community, the black newspapers and things, they were printed in French. And the first history of New Orleans black community was written by Rudolph Desdunes, was written in French. And so Mamie Desdunes, that was her father. So in other words, Jelly Roll parents, they spoke French. So, or Creolized French. And so the word blues, when it comes to New Orleans and its origins, is taken from the old French blaspheme sacre bleu, or sacre bleu. And if you just Creolize that and just add a little, do a slang of sacre bleu, then you get the word blues. Like we're a respectable joint, we don't want any blues. To put it in context, for a long time you had blue laws, and a lot of places still have blue laws. These moral codes or religious codes where you can't gamble on a Sunday, or you can't have a ball or a festival or play music, but that's what we did in Louisiana, from its beginning, on places like Congo Square, and they used to call them balls, but really they were festivals. We'd have festivals every day of the week, just like we do now.
Yeah, nothing's really changed.
Yeah. So blue laws is like the Anglo-Saxon Protestant trying to impose their, rigid, prudish Victorian mores on Louisiana, let the good times roll kind of culture. And the blues kind of came out of that pushback against it. Because Louisiana, for people that, just to remind people, it's more of a Catholic thing, and the Catholic and the Protestant situation was very tense, for many, many years in America. Right now, it doesn't seem like a big deal. The Spanish, who controlled Louisiana for almost a longer time than the French, the Spanish, were pretty relaxed about the expressiveness of its black community, the free people and the enslaved. And so Louisiana just developed very differently from the British colonies like Virginia, the Carolinas, and places like that. We were more a Spanish territory, for the first 100 or so years of our development. And so we developed differently, and the drum was never banned here. So even today, I think that New Orleans and South Louisiana it still has a more Africanized, cultural spirit than any other place in the United States. And as it comes to blues, I mean, I started off trying to give a definition, but the definition in French, when you say something is blue, it means that it is shocking or wholly
blasphemous.
Yes, blasphemous,
Yeah.
or is risque or too sexy, like Bourbon Street, or say like the Moulin Rouge, or or Dave Chappelle might be a blue comic. You might consider him a blue comic, that type of thing. Richard Pryor, was considered a blue comic. Lenny Bruce.
And a lot of these people were very close to the jazz and blues world too. Like they might have tried to cut their own songs singing. They felt it.
That's right. And I think.
And Red Fox is another one who had a little bit going on with the music.
So if it was a little too risque, and for polite society, it was considered blue entertainment or off color, and so the word blues is more subversive definition in the French language. So when Jelly Roll Morton in 1915 published Jelly Roll Blues, it's a subversive message. He's not trying to tell the world that he's sad and depressed and down in the dumps. He's telling people that, after midnight, we're gonna let it all hang out. This was a raunchy, late night, slow dragging, or whatever, kind of music. Whereas before the blues came along, even the black musicians and stuff, they would play a Scottish, or they would play a waltz, or they would play whatever the dance was for the occasion. They would play certain dances that people have practiced these dances and they're gonna dance them. And women would show up to the bars, when women began to show up in the early 1900s, because before that they did not. But young girls would come to these places with corsets on and stuff. But at a blues venue, they would have a corset closet. So they'd take they'll leave home. Their mom and dad will see them leave home with the corset. Mm-hmm. But then they'll throw
the literal version of let it all hang out.
Yeah, throw that in the closet and let it all hang out. At the jam. I use the old term that we don't use as much anymore, Anglo-Saxon. And the reason I use Anglo-Saxon to talk about Louisiana culture, because Louisiana culture is so complex. And if I use dialogue like white and black, and not use some of the older terms like Anglo-Saxon or Negro or whatever, or Creole, which we don't use much anymore. The blues was born in Louisiana in the 1890s. And so when the blues began to take shape here, Italians lived and worked side by side with blacks in Louisiana. They were not yet white or considered first-class citizens. And so they had access to this music, and they had access to the people and the culture, because they all lived and worked together in menial jobs and things like this. And that's how some of the early Italian musicians were able to take part in music, hear the music, because it wasn't on record. You had to be in the place to hear it. So Italians had access to black music, black culture, because they worked side by side, and they weren't yet assimilated into whiteness in America at the turn of the 19th century. And so a lot of these musicians would hear these bands like King Oliver, Kid Ory and them play the blues in the parks and some of the venues and stuff like that. And they, made their version of that sound. And whereas King Oliver and these bands will call themselves the Creole band, these are all black bands call themselves the Creole. And I don't mean like mixed race, it's not a mixed race issue. But so the King Oliver Creole band, which Louis Armstrong ended up being a part of, the Dixieland Jazz Band, Blues Band was modeled after that band and after that type of sound. But then instead of calling themselves a Creole band, which they, rejected because that was considered black, they called themselves Dixieland, the Dixieland Boys, to align themselves with Civil War nostalgia for the Old South and for Dixie. And so they use that as a culture. It's like, in other words, and it also helped with their marketing of their record, because in 1917, white families didn't want to they liked black music, but they weren't going to bring that black music into their homes. So having a Dixieland Jazz Band play this style of music that the nation was starting to take a liking to, and they didn't wear blackface when they did it, by calling themselves Dixie, the Dixieland Boys, original Dixieland band. They aligned them. They were Italian, but they aligned themselves with Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, and kind of passed and made it acceptable in white homes. And that's when this blues sound began to explode across the nation. You know, and in the mid-20s, well, there was what you could call a blues craze.
I wanted to bring up the little factoid that the first blues song published by a lot of people view it to be Antonio Maggio here in New Orleans, the Italian guy who was writing it down long before WC, or half a dozen years before WC Handy.
That's right.
So in your book, one of the key things you do is connect the earliest mentions of the blues and talk about New Orleans, but that's decades before the popularly accepted myth that the blues were really from Mississippi Delta. So that was subsequent history.
Yeah, nobody thought of the blues coming from the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s, including W.C. Handy. It wasn't even, because it just didn't, There were no people, at least no black people in the Mississippi Delta until around the turn of the 19th century. All through slavery, there were never any black people. Like to say that the blues came from slavery and from work songs and things like this. And then they try to associate it with the Mississippi Delta, because the Mississippi Delta is impoverished. It's kind of like they want to make that an equivalency between that and Appalachia.
One of those performers from that era was one that you got to play in a movie. I wanted to get into the Tommy Johnson story. Did you what kind of preparation did it take to take that on?
Well, I used people that I knew personally, like people I'd grown up playing with, like Guitar Kelly. I used his mannerisms and things to model on. Because Tommy Johnson, there's no video of him. I've never heard an interview of his speaking voice, anything. And plus it was a fictional movie. I mean, Oh Brother Where Art Thou is just a send-up, it's a farce, One-Eyed Cyclops and all this kind of stuff. So it was a fun project that was just kind of spoofing, a lot of superstition and stuff, about the Old South and about Mississippi and the Delta. And so, yeah, that was a wonderful opportunity to play Tommy Johnson. But when I had just moved back to America from Europe. I had been living in Europe for some years, and I had just moved back to New Orleans and settled here before I got the part.
What do you think it was that one project became such a hot thing?
I have no idea.
So nothing's come obvious out of that.
I think if I knew that, I don't know if we'd be sitting here today. I'd be, everybody'd be lined up, to have me read their fortune or something. I mean, I have no idea why the thing was a huge commercial success. I mean, I knew it was a success creatively and as a piece of art. The movie, the score, the whole project, was just these people. They know how to make movies. The cinematographer, the way the movie looked, the way T-Bone captured the sound. All of that was. We knew they were making a first-class film. It wasn't a B movie or anything like that. But how the public reacted to it, I mean, that kind of music had never had that kind of success ever. And it changed, I think it influenced a lot of young people. A lot of young people that they were young then, they're not so young now. But a lot of them got introduced to the blues for the first time through my character, through me playing Tommy Johnson and the Hard Time Killing Floor Blues version that I do of Skip James in the film. But that success was phenomenal, and it's still ongoing. I mean, it's still, that was what.
And you did some concert performances too, right? With some of that gang.
Yeah, we were in demand. I mean, we had to go out and we played Carnegie, and as a co-headliner, they put together, Live Nation put together a tour across the nation and in Canada. We played every major basketball arena, like the United Center in Chicago sold out, the Rupp Arena in Kentucky sold out, Red Rocks, the Greek Theater in LA, all these great theaters and concert halls and stuff, and huge basketball arenas sold out to an acoustic concert. It was just nuts. So
every once in a while something with quality breaks through, like when the Buena Vista Social Club was somewhat similar around that time.
Yeah, but I think that was at the peak of the music business, and I would just add this little footnote. At that time, people weren't streaming music. So I don't know even how you would qualify it as a huge success. If people were streaming, people had to actually go to the movie theater and pay to see the movie, and they would go 2 or 3 times to see it, take their friends, and then you couldn't walk out of Virgin Megastore with the record unless the alarm would go off if you tried to steal the record out of the store. You had to pay like 17, $18 to get the album. So, and they sold, beyond 10, 12 million or so of those albums.
So there was also kind of an interesting bridge in that music that kind of showed the sort of perseverance of the blues through all these different styles. So we had like the bluegrass, where it's, a relationship that's harder to figure out. But then you've got things, more country rock in tune, like Man of Constant Sorrow, which ties in that rhythm element. And then you got, straight ahead Delta, old country blues style things. Did they all have a common thread to you? Was that kind of material?
Yeah, well, I used to, on the tour, I'd sit around with Ralph Stanley, we'd talk about these things, But what I know about early bluegrass and what I write about Old Brother Warthow in my book. So there's a chapter in there where I spend some time going into details about how I got the role, and give my thoughts and everything on the making of the movie and its effect on my career. So I deal with that in the book. But I also spend some time talking about Ralph Peer and talking about how Jimmy Rogers and in the early, what we call today country music, how it started, with these rural white players, basically just playing the blues. And they would play them at medicine shows, whatever. They might even wear blacking themselves up. But Ralph Peer recorded Jimmy Rogers in upstate Tennessee in 1927 and kind of really captured that sound. And later, Jimmy Rogers, you can hear him playing the blues he recorded with, even when black and white musicians wasn't supposed to be playing together, him and Louis Armstrong did some recordings out in Los Angeles, around this time as well. So the roots of what they call hillbilly music, it's really just like the Dixieland Band, was doing their version of a black musical invention. Same thing with the rural people. They were playing their version of, what they heard blacks playing. For some people, at least when this book was published, the idea is that the blues came from Mississippi, is what everybody believed. And my argument and the facts show that there's no black history in the Mississippi Delta, because that was the place that the Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaw Nation lived. And they lived there for millennia until they were rooted out of there in the 1840s or so. But they never settled the land before the Civil War, or built levees before the Civil War. And so black people didn't start making their way there until Dockery bought some land from a railroad company in 1895. But it was another 10 years or so before he could entice black people from Alabama and
you
other
didn't
places
really
to
want to
move
live
there
there because they knew it flooded.
Yeah, so the first thing, after you buy all this land for pennies really, then you got to clear the land. So you got to get all the cane brakes and all the trees and the timber. That's the next thing. Get all that timber out of there, put it on the trains and sell that. And then you got to try to build levees, and you got to then start cultivating the land for cotton and things like this. So when we see Muddy Waters and we see these blues people in the 30s, or Robert Johnson and stuff, their families picking cotton in that era, that's believe me, that's downtrodden. You know what I mean? That's pretty rough living, being a sharecropper. But that shouldn't be confused with slavery. There were no blacks in the Mississippi Delta during antebellum time. There's no grave sites of black slaves that I know of. Right. Nobody was there. But every year during Black History Month, people go around to the schools and tell all the little kids the blues came from the Delta and it came from slavery and work, and there was never no work songs there. It's a cultural swindle not only a swindle to reap the financial rewards from the blues, but also a cultural swindle to make sure that black people that originated this great musical art form, which is the greatest musical art form on the planet. We live in the blues era. There might have been the classical era, and the romantic era, or the Baroque era. We've been living in the blues era since Jelly Roll Morton published Jelly Roll Blues.
And let me take that one step further. So you've seen my documentary. It's called Blues Rock Hits Soul Country. It's sort of the companion to the podcast, but I go right into the heart of that issue, how out of the top 20 best-selling acts of all time, about 15 or more of them have paid a serious blues or rhythm and blues apprenticeship. That was the raw material that led to even the most popular.
I would go even a step further. There is no popular music in America that I know of that isn't blues. There's no other music. I mean, C on a piano is C on a piano. So if you're playing a C scale, a pentatonic, if you're playing a 4/4 beat, the only difference is the marketing. And the marketing terms you have to understand are basically, Jim Crow terms, meaning that even though these two people were singing the exact same song, you got the Beatles singing this tune, and you have Chuck Berry singing, or you have Little Richard singing, or Fats Domino singing, or whoever, or Lonnie Johnson singing it. But then just because a person's skin is white and everything is segregated in America, they're playing the same notes, singing the exact same words, the same rhythm and everything. It's just a cover song. But now they got to label it differently. My book is a culture. It's called The Authentic Narrative of My Music and Culture. So blues is a cultural expression, and it was here before the music business arrived, and it'll be here after the record business is long gone and buried. These are all the same notes that everybody is playing, and this is why I think that if a person leaves my book with something, they'll leave with the blues is a musical philosophy. And nobody writes about the blues as a philosophy, meaning that I can take the national anthem and blue it. I can make it subversive just by the way that I approach it. Like Jimi Hendrix doing the national anthem, he took it and blued it, and people were outraged. That's not respectable. But the man was a soldier. He fought for his country, and it's a free country, right? So you can take any particular piece, any kind of music, and blue it. It's in other words, and creolize it. In other words, make it your own. Use it as your cultural expression. And this is not. I'm not saying that this is owned by black Louisianians or black people in general. I'm saying that if you are in South Korea and you want to take rhythm and blues or take the blues music, you can sing your own language to it. You can take it and adapt it and make your own thing with it. The Beatles might have started off as emulators and copying, but they became a very original band through their progression. And so they were singing about their culture, toward the end. We're here for Jazz Fest. Whether or not the brass bands that you hear on the streets of New Orleans or the second line, whether their music sell and hit number one on the chart, I don't think they really.
It's not about that. Yeah, this is a cultural expression. It's
right.
part of your life.
Right. So they're not even. That's not even the reason that they pick up their horns and trombones and play the music. So, and say if Elvis Costello, hears a brass band thing and he decides to write a tune to it, or what's the guy Paul Simon, like he did in South Africa. If you want to take this music and create and make a hit record with it, that's fine if that's what you want to do. But don't come back to New Orleans and start telling the brass bands, y'all got to play y'all music like Elvis Costello or Paul Simon, or y'all playing it wrong. Y'all doing this second line all wrong. It's like our music, the blues is a cultural expression, and it's a musical philosophy that says we're proud of our culture. And we don't want to fully embrace Anglo-Saxon evangelical.
They're just a bunch of prudes who can't have fun.
Yeah, we like how we do it. So if you want us to sing your Christian song, we'll sing your Christian song. We'll sing When the Saints Go Marching In, but we're going to do it. We're going to creolize it. We're going to put our style into it. We're going to make it where we can dance and make it adapted for our culture. And that's really all the blues is.
Something like popular perception got influenced by the popularity of rock and roll that pulled from Delta and Robert Johnson. There's not too many people like that they're so popular when they weren't really known at the time, but then afterwards.
But I'm glad you brought up Robert Johnson, because nobody had heard of Robert Johnson or knew anything about Robert Johnson, really. And he wasn't seen as this genius guitar player when he was alive. He was seen as a good player for people that heard him, but you had Leroy Carr, you had so many other different guitar players that were amazing and doing the same thing, and he was an imitative artist. A lot of songs he was doing, he didn't write those songs. They were songs that he heard on record, and that's very important, because these pseudo folklorists like the Alan Lomaxes and people like that, who are not folk, I wouldn't call them folklorists, especially when it comes to African American folk culture, because they never consulted with any black African. They never went to Africa and talked to the African professors and people who would know. They made a false equivalency with the Delta and with Appalachia and tried to force onto black people what they wanted our folk culture to be. So in other words, they want to make you think that the black person in the Delta he's hearing harmony for the first time, and these complex chords and rhythms for the first time. And then he got a diddly bow. He tied one piece of fishing twine to the tree and another piece of twine to another board, and he started making a sound. And they want to make it like that's the origins or the beginning of black civilization or black high art, music, and culture. And nothing can be further from the truth, because in my book, I lay out the fact that harmony was invented by Africans. The trumpet is an African instrument that is found in ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
The one trumpet is in the key of C 4,000 years ago, and the other one is in the key of B. This is not somebody just taking a moose horn and blowing through it. This is like precisely, high art, harmony. They already knew, I want this in the key of C. I want this one in the key of B. These are going to be in harmony together. That's 4,000 years ago. And so that knowledge was there earlier than that. This is like, so anyway, I'm just saying that people try to create a situation to give the impression that black musicians heard white musicians playing the clarinet and the trumpet, and then we discovered harmony, and melodies and things. And it's just ignorant, and it's not true. And it's part of that eugenic story of trying to deny black history now, authentic black history. And the other thing I need to say, there's two things I want to do. There is this book here that this book is called Urban Blues. And this book was published in 1966. And in 1966, B.B. King was not considered an authentic blues musician. Now, he had some success. Him and Bobby Bland, and who else is in here that they feature? Jimmy Weatherspoon, B.B. King, Bobby Blue Bland, and Ray Charles. But these people I call the Blues Mafia in my book, these people rejected B.B. King because we never seen B.B. King even though he said he worked and plowed a field, we've never seen B.B. King with overalls and an acoustic guitar. So he didn't countrify, even though he's from the Mississippi Delta. This
was in the folk music time frame, right? Where they wanted to make everybody folk.
This is the 1960s when they ran Bob Dylan out of folk music, for going electric. The blues was seen as you could be playing a trumpet like Louis Armstrong. You could be singing and playing the blues like Lonnie Johnson. You could be playing the blues like Joe Turner. There's jump blues. There's all kind of blues is coming in at you in every kind of way, and nobody is arguing whether it's blues or not, because it was just race music, and nobody really cared to give it these.
And the genres are kind of made up anyway. Yeah, it's just a bunch of.
It was just all race music, no matter what you was doing, up until about 1948, and so by the 1960s, you get these people trying to separate blues from rock and roll. In other words, rock and roll is where we're going to make this money. Rock and roll is where we're going to get. We're going to turn this thing into a multi-billion-dollar industry. And yeah, they are playing black music, but somehow we're going to shape the public's perception of the black performers and make them think that they're doing something else. And so, and B.B. King at this time had no white audience. White people wasn't following him around and going to his concerts, and he was frustrated by that. But the acoustic guitar players like Mississippi John Hurt, Son House and stuff was making it on the folk festivals. And like I said, these folk festivals are all near Harvard. And that's, you got to remember, that's the epicenter of racial science in America. And so this is the reason I want to read from this book, because this is his definition of what they're looking for in blues in 1966. And B.B. King did not fit it, even though we revere B.B. King now.
Yeah, he seems like Mr. Blues. Yeah.
But he couldn't get booked on these folk festivals, on these blues festivals in the 60s. He wouldn't have been invited. So I'm going to quote from here. The criteria for a real blues singer, implicit or explicit, are the following. Old age, the performer should perfectly be more than 60 years old, blind, arthritic, and toothless. And he has a quote, as Lonnie Johnson put it, when first approached for an interview, are you another one of those guys who wants to put crutches under my ass? Then the other criteria is obscurity. The blues singer should not have performed in public or have made a recording in at least 20 years. Among deceased bluesmen, the best seem to be those who appeared in a big city one day in the 1920s, made from 4 to 6 recordings, and then disappeared into the countryside forever. Correct tutelage. The singer should have played with or been taught by some legendary figure, agrarian milieu, countrified. A bluesman should have lived the bulk of his life as a sharecropper, coaxing mules and picking cotton, uncontaminated by city influence. Now that's the definition of blues in 1966, and if you didn't fit that definition, then you weren't part of this whole blues canon that these record collectors and these blues mafia types were erecting. And I'll just add that Lonnie Johnson, who is the father of blues guitar, was eliminated from this criteria. He didn't want to play into these people's idea of what the blues should be, because hell, he originated. He was already, everybody was
like
emulating
4 or 5
him.
decades in. Right?
Yeah. It's like, and here's the thing. They said that the criteria should be for an authentic folk performer is that, you learn on oral history. You learn it from your parents, or you don't learn the music in a conservatory or sheet music and things like this. Well, Lonnie Johnson played with his family on the streets of New Orleans. He didn't learn it in some kind of musical school or anything. He didn't learn it from phonograph records because there weren't any when he was starting out. On the other hand, Muddy Waters, Toll Alan Lomax, I learned all these songs from the jukebox. I learned all these songs from my record collection. Robert Johnson learned all his blues recordings and things like that, emulating records. B.B. King, who we all revere as an authentic blues performer, I don't think anybody had a bigger record collection than B.B. King. I mean, he was a DJ for early in his life in Memphis, but this man, record collection, he donated it to the University of Mississippi. I mean, his record collection was in the hundreds, maybe 100-some thousands of records.
He stuck with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, in other words, the Jelly Roll Morton, Lonnie Johnson, King Oliver, these early blues performers out of New Orleans, they didn't learn from records. They learned from hearing it on the street or hearing it in person. They are, if you're going to go by a folk criteria of oral, passing on a culture orally, if that's your criteria, it still brings you to New Orleans. It don't take you to Mississippi because Mississippi learned the blues from phonograph records. I'm not here to rag on Mississippi, and I was on the board of advisors to create the B.B. King Blues Museum, and when I would go into Mississippi and Ida Bena in his hometown before we built before we built B.B. King's Blues Museum, and we would ride around and kind of say, okay, this is the farm where he was at a child, and the barn was still there that he had worked at and drove a tractor, and people would come in and do interviews and tell us stories and stuff, his old classmates or people that knew him as a child. So in other words, I've done movies. I've done Last of the Mississippi Jukes. I've done so many documentaries on the Delta and on Mississippi blues. I've done so many things to promote Mississippi culture. But the movies that I played, at least the movie Old Brother Warthout, is fictional. So it's not a true story of the Delta, but it's playing with popular myths. So yeah, I was playing Tommy Johnson, but Tommy Johnson wasn't the guy at the crossroads center, so that's supposed to be Robert Johnson. So none of it should be taken too seriously when it comes to a fictional movie. That's just having fun in a spoof. But some of these documentaries that I've been a part of, I have sit down like I'm sitting with you, and I have told people some of these things. Now, I'm not saying that 20 years ago or 30 years ago as a teenager, I knew everything there is to know about blues. No, I did believe that I was part of a continuum here in Louisiana with my father, Rockin' Tabby Thomas. I grew up in a jug joint, playing the blues. That was the family business for 25 years. So I think I know a little something about a Friday or Saturday night in a jug joint. That's what I had to do for a living I've been doing this since I was 11 years old professionally. So, and when I was writing my book, I went to Africa and had these conversations in West Africa, researching the blues, and did the blues come from there and all this stuff here. And they laughed at me and told me, you need to stop promoting that myth. So I'm saying all that to say that I've done a lot to promote Mississippi culture, and they've made some money with things that I have done. But here on out, my focus is not to dismiss Mississippi, but to embrace my culture here in Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana, and I think that the Louisiana blues musicians, get shortchanged. I mean, and a lot of times we don't even get included when they talk about blues. We're out of sight, out of mind. It's like we're not even part of the South. It's like we're not even part of the whole story of the blues. How can you talk about the blues and talk about the South and never mention any New Orleans musicians?
How much of that do you feel like is the fault of Louisiana, the state, for not getting behind it in quite the same way that Mississippi did? Because they've got their blues highway and they've got so many museums.
Yeah, I mean, there's a plague on the state of Louisiana for not. They dismissed ownership of the blues and orphaned the blues, made an orphanage of the blues many, many years ago. But I think the origin story is so important just to get that straight, because we need young musicians that's going to come up and play this music. You want to reach young people and have them be attracted to this music, but if you tell them they can only play these 3 chords, if you play that 4th chord, no, that's not the blues. You only got. If you give these people these false, and it's not like if you give them these false boxes and you try to put them in these boxes, well, they're going to say, well, I don't like the blues, when that's not what the blues is anyway. I was discovered by a folklorist, in 1979. So I'm the last, blues musician to come to prominence. Being like Muddy Waters was discovered by a folklorist from the Library of Congress, and so many other people. Jelly Roll Morton, made those famous recordings for the Library of Congress. My first album is at the Library of Congress. So I came into the picture as this supposedly primitive, illiterate, blues musician who learned from his father in a jug joint.
And this was on Our Hooli? Was the Our Hooli record? My
first album came out on Our Hooli, which is the preeminent, folk label. Chris Strackwich, thank you very much. And this was my beginning. And so for me to come and write this book, and to kind of, it's kind of like the lion, telling his story or whatever, you know what I mean? It's like I'm the last one that came out of this whole thing. I didn't know it was a eugenic thing that brought me into the world. I was looking to go to fucking Soul Train, I was trying to make a record to get, to have a hit record or something. I didn't know that I was supposed to be, this illiterate,
And that gets back into like your origins. So you got Baton Rouge, your father's a bluesman, you grew up at the Blues Juke Joint Club.
Yeah, and so when Old Brother came out, to try to answer your question, when Old Brother came out, I had no idea it was going to be a success, but it superseded anything that Lead Belly had done, anything that any other folk blues musician that had been discovered by folklorists and brought to the attention of the world, like I had been, it exceeded commercial expectations and just shattered what anybody had imagined.
And it had a lot of everybody's blues in there. So from the prison song, the work songs, the bluegrass, gospel. I mean, that's all in there.
The New Orleans music is the original blues that came out here. And then what we find in the Delta with Mississippi John Hurt and people like that, they are just emulating what Lonnie Johnson. Lonnie Johnson took what Louis Armstrong and these people were doing, and what Jelly Roll was doing on the piano. He transposed that to the guitar, and then the rural people in Oklahoma and Tennessee and all over the South heard Lonnie Johnson records, and from 1925 onward, and began to try to emulate that sound and the way he sang and played the guitar. And that's how we got this Delta blues. It's like a derivative of.
Okay, so another time you got into the Delta frame of mind to be an actor was with Wim Wenders, one of Germany's cinematic greats. I was a film student, so I like to talk about these things. What was it like working with Wim Wenders?
I don't remember working with Wim Wenders very much.
That was Martin Scorsese as the parent of the project?
I mean, I remember the project exactly, but if you ask me to talk to you about Wim, I remember going to his house out in Hollywood, in the Hollywood Hills, interviewing with him. He had been successful from Denver Vista Social Club with a musical documentary, and so he was making this documentary, wanted me to play Blind Willie Johnson. And I had just filmed Old Brother. I don't know if Old Brother had come out yet or not. But maybe it had come out. I don't know. I mean, I think I was in between that and the Ray movie, But anyway, I was in Hollywood, all kinds of projects was coming my way. And I decided I'd do that with, I think it may be, the one person who might have benefited from it was Bobby Rush, I think.
Yeah, he looked good. He took him to the church the next day. Remember I said I got.
Yeah, I think Bobby Rush. It gave him a leg up. Maybe introduce some people to him.
He was in episode 2, so we'll all know about him.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about this one. The country blues guys of the 20s, 30s, 40s, who brought the guitar work in and the songwriting.
About the mid-20s to the late 20s, the whole nation was aware of the blues, and the whole nation was. This was popular music. It was like the rap music of its day. It was popular music from coast to coast, and it's what everybody wanted to hear, and what most musicians wanted to play. The sharecropping musicians, in the Mississippi Delta, those musicians, they weren't professional musicians. A lot of them were dilettante musicians. They could hardly take a solo or anything. And people have sat around and tried to tell me that George Benson is not as good a guitar player as Charlie Patton. Or somehow Ray Charles is just not as good a blues singer as. I mean, what are you talking about? You know what I'm saying? This is nuts, and you can't reason or rationalize it, other than what they're doing is the old switcheroo, where it's a cultural swindle. They're trying to present to the world that this is authentic African American. So ignore those geniuses, ignore Louis Armstrong, ignore these other people over here, and focus on this primitive guy.
So, also we talked about the last century of actual time here, back to 1922. There was the enormous popularity of Jimmy Rogers. He was a kind of a blues knowledgeable guy who was a railroad guy, and heard the songs. Hank Williams was similar, had the Black Teacher. All the kingpins of country music were parlaying the engine of blues through country, or they didn't even call it country, it's called music back then, I think.
Yeah, because there's no such thing as country music. It's just blues.
Yeah, it's still blues related, yeah. And so then I'm going to keep moving here. Popularization of blues in some form went well into the blues rock era in the mid-'70s. That's when we both grew up. The Led Zeppelin and Cream and Stones and all that stuff was heavily blues. And I think in your book you refer to it as low down and dirty. Were you a rock fan back then? I guess that's my question.
I'm not a rock fan, but I just like the guitar, and I like loud guitars. Uncle Don Washington would take me to his home and give me, he was a trumpet player, and he would give me trumpet lessons. And I had a little cornet that he bought in Korea when he was in the war, and he came back and gave it to me and brought me to his house, and I learned how to play scales and the trumpet and stuff. Learned how to play the cornet through him. And so I was set on being a trumpet player like my uncle. But this was also at the time that the guitar would be becoming the dominant instrument in the blues. And so, my dad kind of said, if you want to lead a band, instead of playing the trumpet, you might want to play the guitar, because the guitar had superseded the trumpet. And that's interesting because Miles Davis tried to compete with the guitar and tried to continue to make the trumpet the main instrument of the blues. He tried to play it through an electric amp, through wah-wah pedals. He tried everything, all kinds of echo and all kind of experimentation. But the trumpet just wasn't gonna be an electric instrument. The harmonica, however, worked good through amplification. Little Walter, proved that. It sounded fantastic on record, but a trumpet through electronic gadgets just didn't work. The main thing you could do with it, the wah-wah and the mute, he innovated those things. And I would say even, but that goes back to Papa Joe, King Oliver, that's the kind of stuff that he was doing, that he innovated or originated. But the trumpet was becoming lesser and going to the background, and the guitar was louder, more able to cut through the audience, more able to reach a larger audience, and it became the emblem of the blues. And so I gravitated toward the guitar.
What advice do you have for a young musician who's trying to succeed in the business?
Oh man, I don't really. My first instinct is to tell them, don't do it. The second thing I would just tell them is, try to be true to yourself, and don't take shortcuts with your talent.
All right, good, solid answers. Good for life, even. Tell me about your next tour, or your next shows upcoming. Anything big coming up for you?
I don't have a big announcement. I'm just going to continue now that COVID is kind of behind us. I'm going to try to get out here and tell people about this book and tell this story, and try to shift the nation's attention from the Mississippi Delta to New Orleans when they think of the blues. I want people when people think of Delta blues or think of the blues period, I want them to think New Orleans first and everything else second, because that's the way it should be.
If you could get a ticket to see any artist of all time play, who would it be?
Honestly, I don't like live music.
Oh, really? Is that okay?
I mean, I don't hate it, but the record is what drew me into the music business. And I'm just not I don't need to see them perform it and stuff. But I will say, they might find interesting that what pulled me in was the sound of the room. It wasn't the guitar and the bass and the drum. It was the spaces in between. When I can hear the room, it just sounded like something exciting was happening in the room. And I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to be there when this excitement was happening, you know what I mean? So you can kind of hear when the band said, boom, and then they stop, and then you can kind of hear the echo and stuff in some of these earlier records. Not 20s, and I'm talking 60s and 70s, 80s, But now the room is sampled. It's not a real room, whereas you hear hit the road jack, or you hear some, you hear some good old
the crack
R&B.
of a snare means something.
Yeah, it's like that rum is authentic, and it tells you a lot about the excitement and the space and the fun everybody was having. And I just wanted to be in that atmosphere.
Now I'm thinking about Cosmos at the laundromat.
Cosmos,
yeah,
man.
yeah.
We haven't talked about that, but that's so important to the blues story.
Yeah.
The sound of the records is what drew me in to wanting to make records of my own. And if I don't perform, but a few concerts a year, I'm okay with that.
And then you're writing enough to fill up your whole plate as producer. You don't ever go produce other artists?
They don't ask me.
Okay, just checking. All right.
But I'm open to that.
Thank you, Chris Thomas King, for venturing into soul country and a special taping in New Orleans, Uptown. Truly one of the Crescent City's great music rooms. Chris Thomas King, we've got The Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture. It's just come out in hardback.
Yeah, so the book is available. It's an audio book. It's a hard copy book. It's actually out on CD as well, and it's electronic. And so you can purchase it at Amazon anywhere in the world. And if you want an autographed copy, you can get that from on my website, christhomasking.com.
And I want to say a special thanks to Reed Mathis for our title track, We Ride. Tune in again to Soul Country for more insight into the music, culture, and lore of roots music. All right, Chris, thanks again for coming by Soul Country.
My pleasure.